everyone, this is Richard with Richard Beer Reviews, and today I got a very interesting story. This is not about any particular beer, any particular brand. It's more about how American ales and American lagers came to be. In the introduction to the New World, America, and how they came to be in their battle against whiskey. So stick around, you might find this interesting. See you. Small background on ales and lagers. The two main groups of beers, ales and lagers. Ales come from England and lagers come from Germany. So the first beer introduced to the New World was obviously an ale because we were colonized by the British, otherwise we'll be Fränkische Deutsch. So our first beer introduced to the Americas was an ale. That was in the 1700s. So in those times, beer was a standard ration for the sailors because those trips were long trips. They were like 6-9 months. And they were long trips, and obviously they didn't have refrigeration, so nutrition was a major issue. And beer was a way to prevent scurvy and dysentery. So they drank beer, the sailors, all the way here. Maybe that's why it took them so long. But so when they came to the United States and they introduced the ale beer. Now, American ales are different than British ales. American beers are characterized by the many creative ingredients that we put on our beer to develop flavors. And most beers take their flavors from the ingredients. And especially back then, if you're using local ingredients to make the beer, it's going to take very different than the ingredients that they use in England. So they started using all these new ingredients, and they gave the beers a very different flavor than the British ale. Now, in those times, the sailors or the colonists would have been more than happy to reproduce the same flavor that they were getting from their ales from their hometown. But the problem was that the colonies found that they couldn't grow barley, which is an essential product of ales, in the new territories. They just couldn't grow it. So instead of using barley, they started substituting with potatoes, molasses, and other products to make their beer. So through the next 100 years, brewers began to emerge in the United States. Now there's a little bit more sophistication. There's a little bit of know-how on growing barley in certain parts of town, and also they can even ship it from England. But remember that in those times, breweries were extremely a local thing. There was no brewery big enough where they can ship materials from one side of the country or continents or nothing like that. So, but about 100 years later, large populations developed in Pennsylvania and New York, and breweries started to grow. So New York was able to bring hops and barley from the western parts of the states and use the Erie Canal. This is a very important river run in the beer history, because that's basically where all the beer ingredients came through to produce the beers in the largest breweries of the time that became some of the giants that we know today. So, and Albany had a strategic advantage because of the rivers, and more than 20 breweries were brewing in Albany. Taylor's and Sons, I don't think they're still around, or there might be under a different name, but they were the largest brewery in the 1850s. Still, brewing beer was still a small market because the new generation See, even back then in the 1850s, they had millennials come in and screw it up. So even the new generation in the 1850s was starting to switch from beer to the new liquor, whiskey, that we call whiskey. So they call it a libation. So whiskeys and rum. Rum was a very exotic drink at those times because, as we know, rum is made by sugar from the Caribbean. So it's an imported product. So it's, I guess like we think of wine today, like French wine or something like that. It was very exotic, but much more rare. I mean, you can get a bottle of wine anywhere right now, but at those times rum was very. So rum took on a new desirable liquor, and whiskey, because whiskey was homegrown and it could be easily distilled, and so very inexpensive. And of course, from all the movies we've seen, whiskey became the drink of the West. Besides, you don't need refrigeration for whiskey, but beer goes bad without refrigeration. So that was a major difference. So I'm gonna pause here. I'm gonna get me an ale to show you one of the ales I'm talking about, and give you a few of the ales and continue the story. Okay, so getting back to the American ales. Like I mentioned, I said I was gonna bring one to kind of showcase what an excellent American ale is. This happens to be one of my favorite beers. This is a type of ale called Indian Pale Ale. But the reason I brought this, because American ales are characterized by robust flavors and strength and saturation of hops and a distinctive taste, aroma. So this is exactly that. This is robust flavor, massive saturation of hops and flavors. So this is one of my favorite beers. This is because this is the evolution of what an awesome American ale is or can be. So back to the story. So in about by the time, like I said, this is in the 1860s now, whiskey is taking over the drinking, as opposed to becoming more popular than beer. As a matter of fact, but in the 1860s, there were over 100 distilleries. Distilleries what makes whiskey, and breweries is what makes beer. So there were over 100 distilleries for every one brewery. That was the ratio of the alcohol drinks made in the United States. 100 times the whiskey for one brewery of beer. This is in the 1960s. So that was, I guess, the low point of brewery. And I think it's partly because brewery was still very unsophisticated, the way it was done, very irregular. So imagine if a beer you like, every bar you went tasted different. So you can easily lose the flavor for that beer. But whiskey always tasted the same. And again, beer had the complication of refrigeration. So in the late 1860s, the Germans started coming. The Germans are coming. So they started coming, and they brought with them a much more sophisticated and accurate. The Germans, everything's freaking engineering accurate. So they brought a much more sophisticated and accurate form of brewing. But of course, their style of beer is not ales. Their style of beer is lagers. So when they brought this system, it was also able to be reproduced and give you the exact same taste, continuous, and it became the reason the beer became popular, because now you can go from one state to another and buy the same beer and it will taste the same way, and your flavor was always consistent, and the beer was always available because they were able to brew year long. This became the beer of mass quantities, and that is why, even though ales were the first beer introduced to this country, not till the Germans got here in the 1860s, late 1850s, then we really figured out how to produce beer properly in the industrial scale. And that's why the Germans brought the lager style beer. That's why the lager is the predominant beer that we drink in the United States. A lager is, if you drink a Budweiser, if you drink a Coors, if you drink a Miller Lite, if you drink a Corona, those are all lagers. Those are a German style of beer. That's why the American public loves now the lagers, because that's the beer that grew the Americas. So by the 1920s, when Prohibition began, the preferred alcohol beverage in this country was now the lager. So we went from ales that were introduced by the colonists, then whiskeys, because of the circumstances of production and refrigeration in the new generation. And we went then to lagers because of the new settlement of the Germans and their knowledge of precise and industrial scale production of beer. So that's the story of beers in the United States, and why there is about 50 lagers sold for every one ale in the United States. I hope you like this. If you do, press the thumbs up, and if you watch this on Facebook and you want to see another video of this, I'll try to get them going a little bit more often. So press the subscribe. See you later, suckers.